people. And next up, we're going to have Jeffrey Statland. Dr. Jeffrey Statland is going to be on, a researcher and associate professor, University of Kansas Medical Center. That is a name we should all know very well, right? Should all know it very well. And here he is now. Hello, Dr. Statland. How are you doing?
I'm doing very good. How are you doing?
I am doing well, indeed, sir. Thank you for asking.
Yeah.
My voice is getting a little dry. But
I bet. This has been all day, has it? No. Yeah.
Right. But that's why you're here. So I talk less, and then the guests come in and they do this phenomenal job that they've done all day, no pressure. And they and they continue to carry the torch. So tell us a little bit about your current work and what you're doing as associate professor there at University of Kansas Medical Center.
Sure. So we have a rather large clinical program in FSHD. I think if I see what my role would be, a number of years ago, the basic scientists, they figured out what causes FSHD. And when they did that, they figured out that there was this protein that was causing FSHD by causing damage to the muscles. And this identified a target for therapy. So at that point in time, we really started changing the questions we were asking from, what causes FSHD to how can we treat it? Well, when you start talking about treatments in different types of disorders, you have to think about clinical trials. And so along with my colleague, Robbie Tawil, this was about 10 years ago now, we started asking the question, are we really ready for clinical trials in FSHD? And so we did a number of things to try to prepare. Robbie, along with some of the scientists we were working with, we put together some workshops. We got a lot of our colleagues together. We got the advocacy groups involved and patients as well. And we said, what do we know about measuring FSHD? How are we going to tell if we have a treatment that it's working? And people got together and the companies as well were there and they said, well, we still need to know more. There's more we need to know. And so we really said, how are we going to get the information we need to help the companies take these new therapies and bring them to clinical trials? And what we decided was, well, we needed to be able to run some studies. And at the time, there really wasn't a way to do this. Everyone was sort of in their place and they were working on their own. And so we said, why don't we get together and we'll get a group of sites who have the same goal to prepare for clinical trials. And we had the idea to put together a research network to do that. And so we really started a clinical trial research network for FSHD back in 2016 with 4 sites who just got together because they were already doing research in FSHD, and we decided to sort of pool our resources, but it grew quite quickly from them. We currently have 12 sites who are participating in the United States. We have 6 sites now who are collaborating with us in Europe. And the goal really is to help get the tools that we're going to need to run efficient and high quality clinical trials. And so if you think about a carpenter who has a job to build a house, and they'll tell you, well, you need the right tools to do the job. Well, the tools that we need for clinical trials are called outcome measures. And just like a carpenter, it takes the right outcome measure for the right job. And depending on where a drug is at in development, you may need a very different tool. And so it turns out you don't need one outcome measure, you need a whole toolbox full of them. And so we've been sort of putting those studies together to help us get that information. We've picked out the types of tools we think we would be needing. We got the money together to run the studies to do this, and we've been very lucky that people have been very generous to participate in the studies. So we have several studies running now to help sort of fill these gaps and get the tools that we think will be important for clinical trials.
That's amazing to create that network. So yeah, people or researchers aren't working all independently. Collaboration. How has that sped up the process, do you think?
Well, a number of ways. I mean, I think having all these sites sort of collaborating together, one thing that it allows us to do is it allows us to make sure we're training people so they're doing the same thing in the same way.
Mm.
And so we have people that we call them evaluators. They're often physical therapists. They help measure how strong someone is, how well they do different tasks. And so we go to each of these sites and we make sure they're all trained. So if we're measuring how someone's walking or we're measuring their strength, we're doing it in the same way at all of the different centers. But we also do things to reach out to the people with FSHD in our local communities. And so by having research going on, we may have activities where we bring people in and we educate them about what we're doing, but you learn to identify and know the people in your area who have FSHD. And that's really important because when companies go to do a clinical trial, they need to know that if they start the trial, there'll be people there who will volunteer and participate. And so I think if we look at the studies that have happened in FSHD, there have been 2 clinical trials that have occurred in the last few years, one by a company called Acceleron, another one by a company called Fulcrum. I think having a network of sites together that were sort of already working on FSHD helped accelerate the process. It enables you to get people into the studies faster, make sure that the sites that are participating are ready to have high quality measurements and do well in the study. And so I do think it's making it faster. So companies, once they get started, it's a little bit faster for them to get up and running.
Mm-hmm.
I think most importantly, though, are the companies that are to come. And these are the people who are maybe developing what everyone's real excited about, which would be, gene-based therapies or therapies that are really disease targeted. These companies have to have information to plan their clinical trials. So they need the information that can help them be confident if they start the program and they start, spending the millions of dollars to run these studies, that they can get the information that they're going to need. And so having the network and the studies up and running, it allows us to give the data that people need about FSHD and how we measure it to these companies so they can plan for their studies.
Wow, that's connectivity, right? It seems like that's like the theme. It kind of cuts a lot of the red tape out,
Yeah.
answers a lot of the questions. But how about that community involvement? If it's the FSHD Society community out there, the FSHD community, their involvement. If it's volunteering for clinical trials or studies or those things, how important, how key is that?
Yeah, I always tell people this. So it's not the researchers who develop therapies. It's really not the companies that develop therapies. We do it as a community. If you look at our network and the things we're doing, it's really I think a good example of that. If you think about just the practical side, the financial side, well, we have funding that comes from an amazing array of different sources. We have individual donors who've given money. We have our advocacy groups like the FSHD Society. They were amazingly helpful, especially early on before we really had money to run the studies. Our own government, the National Institutes of Health, has helped us with money to do the studies. Our other advocacy groups like Friends of FSH Research. And so there's a whole quilt work of people who gave financially to help us do these studies, including the companies. A number of companies have also given money to make this happen. In the same way, it's all the key people have to be involved when you do the studies, or they don't really mean as much. And so when we were starting to do this, we actually had a large group of patients and their family members, and we still do, who we go to ask them questions. We ask about, how should we do the study? What's important to you? What do you think is a good outcome measure? What would you measure if you were thinking how to do this? We have input from the advocacy groups who are, they give us money, but they also give us the help. And so they give us advice when we're developing things. And so I'd say it's a real partnership on all aspects, and it takes all of us working together to make any advancements that we're going to have for people with FSHD.
Yeah, it's It's amazing work that you've created within that network. Is there any studies that show the most hope, I guess? Maybe I'm trying to think of the mind of like the listener, right? The FSHD patient that's listening. What is like something that excites you that you're seeing that's being worked on right now?
Yeah, well, I mean, I always tell people I think it's a very hopeful time. And, when you consider what's going on in the last year with the pandemic and really all aspects of our life in a way coming to a halt, it hasn't really halted our forward progress in research for FSHD. Um, I think it's a very hopeful time. There's a lot of reasons to be hopeful. The chemistries and technologies we have are coming forward that will enable us to think about true disease-targeted therapies. There are companies who know how to work with these drugs and academic researchers as well who are committed to developing the therapies, and they're all moving forward. If you just look 10 years ago, we really didn't have any active clinical trials in FSHD. Over the last 5 years, we've had 3 clinical trials going on, and I think we're looking to have many more in the next 5 years. So, I mean, I think it's an incredibly hopeful time. At the same time, I do tell people it does take some patience. The first company who comes with a drug is often not the one that's going to have the drug that's going to work for everyone. But the fact that we've made this progress and there's companies here and they're developing therapies, this raises this increases the likelihood we're going to see something that works. And so I do think it's a very hopeful time.
You think in our lifetime there could be at least a treatment to at least slow down FSHD?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think the likelihood is very high that we'll have treatments that will change what we think of when we think of FSHD. We're hopeful we'll have more dramatic treatments than that. I mean, our goal would be to have treatments that will fundamentally alter what it's like to have FSHD and hopefully make it a very different type of disorder. But yeah, I think in our lifetimes, we're really seeing a type of acceleration. I think the technology and our ability to use these tools has really accelerated the last few years. We've seen really groundbreaking, amazing therapies approved for other inherited disorders. For Duchenne muscular dystrophy, there's been a number of gene-based therapies approved. There's been a true gene replacement therapy for spinal muscular atrophy. And some of these treatments have really changed how we think of those disorders. And I think the same may be true for FSHD over the next few years, that we'll see something come along that will change the way we think about FSHD and hopefully, have a real strong benefit for people.
2020, you mentioned it, has not been a great year.
No,
COVID-19,
no.
right? Has that pandemic then slowed the progress, do you feel, in some of the studies and the clinical trials that are going on?
Well, I mean, it wouldn't be fair to say no. I mean, the pandemic has affected all aspects of our life. So in research, it's very much the same. There was a period of time where many of our studies, we couldn't bring people into the centers to actually do the research visits. That's changed a little bit, and we take precautions now. We're very concerned about people's health, and so we bring people in, we make sure we screen them, we make sure everyone's wearing proper precautions, and that we're not in any kind of a crowded space. But the research is still going on. Like I said, we're very committed to continuing it. There is a clinical trial active, Fulcrum Therapeutics, and I won't say it didn't affect their study, but they adapted and the study's continuing and it hasn't stopped. So I would say, yeah, it's had an effect, but in a way, the research, it's continued. And so far, I would say that, the pandemic is making us all adapt, but we're continuing. There's some things that people may experience that would be an unintended benefit in a way of the pandemic. For example, for years, I think we've been pushing to have what are called telehealth visits. So visits where we could see patients where they didn't have to physically come in to the clinic to be seen, and the pandemic enabled that to occur. And so we can now see people and have virtual visits a lot like we're on Zoom now. You can do a medical visit on Zoom.
Yeah.
And so
Yes.
that's an unanticipated benefit.
Yes. Yes. Right. There's some silver lining in there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Doing the virtual, yeah, that you can still do those things, or even sometimes it's better. Oh man, that's crazy.
Yeah, and so we're all real committed. We're hoping that this all continues. So of course, now that we've started, we don't really want to stop.
Right.
Um,
I don't think there's anything wrong with that. If it's a good idea and it's been
yeah,
working, then we can,
absolutely.
because of COVID, turn a negative into a positive. So how about 2021? You know, what are we looking at, as in, do you see more studies coming up or clinical trials coming up down the pipe for the next year?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's going to be a number of different types of studies, actually. So we're still running one of the largest, I call it a clinical trial preparedness study, but it's a type of natural history study. It's to refine the trial strategies and the tools that we use. We have a study that will follow 300 people for 2 years. We're really just over halfway through it. And so all the people who are participating, we really encourage them to stay committed and keep with us, because this will be a benefit for the field for decades to come. And we've never had a study like this in FSHD. There was a prior study similar to this in the late 90s, but it was really only a couple of centers, you know, around 80 or so patients. So this is an international study. We have people from Europe, from the United States, and we'll be following people for 2 years. So this will be a really valuable resource. There's a lot we'll learn about FSHD in a study like this. Along with that study, there's other pieces we need. That study is really looking for the kinds of things you might use to get a drug approved, things that are strength or functional. We also have a need for biomarkers. These are things that the types of tools you use when you're asking a slightly different question, like, will a drug reach its target and have an effect?
Mm-hmm.
And maybe it's something you look at inside the muscle or in your blood. Well, we're going to have a need for these studies as well. And so we have a study going on now, looking at MRI and muscle biopsies. And the reason we're doing it is most of the drug companies who are developing therapies are thinking that's what they're going to use for their early proof their drugs are working.
Mm.
Those studies are going on now, and people can participate in them. We have a study starting up to look at remote assessments. We're in the middle of a pandemic, so you'd say, well, why can't we do measurements and think about doing clinical trials where people don't have to travel to centers? And so we're trying to build the structure to do that. So down the road, companies can offer these types of visits as part of their study. So there's not as much need for someone to travel in person to come to one of our centers. Along with the work we're doing, there are other groups around the world who are also doing studies and preparing. So I do think there'll be a lot of opportunities like that for people. The drug companies are out there and they're working hard to move their programs forward. We'll all learn whether Fulcrum will have another study when they reach the end of the current study. And if hopefully, fingers crossed, it will be successful, in which case we may see another study from them. If for some reason it isn't, well, there are several other companies who are moving into the space. The timing of when they'll be ready to do a trial in people, though, will depend a little bit on their programs. And so don't want to make promises that I can't keep. But I think over the next couple of years, we'll probably see further clinical trials starting.
Wow, that's very exciting. Very exciting news. And that's kind of what we really need as we try to get through this pandemic time. Need a little hope, and knowing the direction's still being pushed in the right way here. All awesome news. Awesome news. Thank you, Dr. Statland, for joining us today on the FSHD Radiothon, and taking part and giving us some amazing hope and great news. Really appreciate it.
Sure, it's been my pleasure.